What's really good, folks? Welcome to Warless's Workshop of Wonders, where we examine the rules for Dungeons and Dragons 5th Edition, break them apart, and see if we can craft them into something that's more interesting and better for your tables. Check it out. Today at the workshop, we'll be breaking down the much-hated spell Counterspell and changing it from what's essentially a magical delete button into a set of rules that helps create epic mage battles at your table. Let's start by taking a quick look at the spell's rules here. Counterspell is a 3rd level spell with a casting time of 1 reaction, range of 60 feet. You attempt to interrupt a creature in the process of casting a spell. If the creature is casting a spell of 3rd level or lower, its spell fails and has no effect. If it's casting a spell of 4th level or higher, make an ability check using your spellcasting ability. The spell's DC equals 10 plus the spell's level. On a success, the spell fails and has no effect. At higher levels, yes, you can upcast a spell. At higher levels, when you cast a spell using a spell slot of 4th level or higher, the interrupted spell has no effect if its spell level is less than or equal to the level of the spell slot that you used. So on close examination, we see a number of problems with the spell that are both unbalancing and not really fun. They kind of sap the fun out of gameplay. Starting with the most egregious one probably is that the spell negates the original caster's turn entirely. If you can imagine, when you're casting a spell, you're using an action to cast a spell like Fireball. Then, when you cast it, your opponent is using Counterspell as a reaction to entirely negate your action. So that ruins the action economy, throwing the entire thing off balance without any real cost to the counterer, other than losing a spell slot, which you also lose. 2, the original caster has to declare the level of the spell as they're casting the spell. So, if I'm casting a fireball, I have to declare that it's a 3rd level fireball. So that means that I'm saying I'm casting a 3rd level fireball. The opponent can simply say, well, I'm going to cancel it with a level 4 spell slot. Done. Once again, my turn is canceled, and there's nothing I can do about it. And it feels terrible. It's an awful feeling. I mean, it feels great for players when they get to do it to a DM's NPCs, and that's a whole other story. But it feels great for them. But really, when it gets turned around the other way, it really sucks. Because ultimately, it's a game about turns, and you're waiting for your turn to be able to make an action. You can't make that action because somebody else just decided, oh, I'm going to go out of turn to ruin your turn. Plus, there are a ton of spells that can't even be leveled up. We're talking about utility spells. So you can't really upcast Rope Trick or any number of other spells, right? They only have their original effect. So that means that you can just blip it out right away. From 3rd level or lower, it's done. So lower level spell's gone. Even when you have to roll to negate the spell, it's still only a static DC that's dependent on the spell's level, not the caster. So the caster's ability has no bearing on it whatsoever. Proficiency, spell attack ability, none of those things have anything to do with the DC. It's as easy for me to stop a spell from Ron Weasley as it is from Voldemort, according to these rules. As long as the spell level's the same, it's not really any different. And that's ridiculous. The spell itself is limited to like a handful of classes. So we have wizards, bards, I think warlocks maybe get them, sorcerers, but still, only a handful of casters can get this spell. That kind of limits it in a way. So a wizard who has the highest number of spells and like prep spells and slots can just dominate the playing field. And they already do. And we can get into at another point we'll get into the linear fighter quadratic wizard problem. I think in general spellcasters are really unbalanced and wizards are at the top of that. Finally, it requires no thought on the point of the caster. So not only are you not rolling for anything, you don't even have to think about what the spell was. You literally just blip it out of existence. And once again, maybe that's fun for a little bit, but it could be better. It just feels anticlimactic. You think about it as a DM. You're narrating the BBEG's big spell. And in the middle of your narration, before you can even finish, your players just yell out Counterspell. And it feels great for them because it feels like a moment of triumph. I've seen a number of things with Scanlan on Critical Role. Scanlan just cancels a Counterspell. Or Counterspell's a Counterspell or counters a spell and immediately lays Matt flat on the ground, right? He doesn't even know how to react to that. And that's a natural thing. As a DM, we're expected to move on the fly all the time. So we're in the middle of narration. We're in that scene. So to be interrupted at that point really pulls us out of the game. And it's even worse for players because a player has been waiting their turn to cast that spell, right? To make an action that's going to feel impactful in combat. But it just gets canceled out. And I could do it as simply as just having 2 NPCs with Counterspell. So you cast a spell, I counter that spell, you counter that counter, and then somebody else counters that counter. So done. And then it just becomes a game of Uno. So my idea is something different. Instead of having Counterspell exist as a spell, it exists as a rule that can be applied to any spellcaster within the game. Now let's take a look at the rule. As a reaction before a spellcasting roll or save has been made, a spellcaster can choose to counter a spell. They do so by expending an equal or higher spell slot and a spell of the same school to attempt to counter it. Both casters then make a contested roll using their spell attack modifiers. If the countering caster beats the original caster, the spell is nullified. If the countering caster burns the exact same spell, they can reflect it back once they beat the original caster in the contested roll. So, much like in combat where you can make an opportunity attack using your reaction, you would be able to use that same reaction to counter a spell instead. Now you may be thinking to yourself, wait, since it's still a reaction and it no longer requires that you prepare a spell beforehand in order to counterspell, doesn't that make it easier to counterspell? The short answer is not really. Since the rule no longer gives spell slots the ability to cancel spells out entirely, especially if they're higher level, it eliminates both the feeling of having something fizzle out and cancel entirely, and the Uno-like outbidding that happens when you declare a spell level and somebody declares a spell level that's higher than yours when they're countering it. This in turn drives up the playability of spells that either can't be leveled or are low level and would normally be canceled entirely. Plus, let's not forget the importance of making it a contested roll. Dungeons & Dragons is built on the idea of rolling a d20, and not just for the sake of randomness, but all the things that it represents. The addition of modifiers isn't just a numerical value, but rather a representation of where your character is and what they've invested in. By determining the results of a counterspell based on both parties' abilities, that means that you have a better representation of what is happening out on that battlefield. And because we're opening it up to all spellcasters, we can have interactions that we've never had before on our tables. Nature Domain clerics versus druids to see who is the ultimate protector of the forest, or paladins squaring off against arcane tricksters. The possibilities become nearly limitless, especially with all the new spellcasting subclasses, feats, and other abilities that are being introduced in the game. Last, but certainly not least, is the spell school matching requirement in order to counter a spell. This requires a player to think smart when they're countering a spell. It encourages players to understand the spells that they have at their disposal and rewards them for having more diverse loadouts, since it leads to more scenarios where they can possibly counter a spell. And finally, to all the DMs out there who've been super frustrated by having their narrative flow cut short by an anti-climactic counterspell use, since an actual spell needs to be used in order to counter a spell, it gives the DM better tools to explain and narrate what's happening in this complex interplay between two powerful arcane forces. It gives them the ability to play out how the magic looks instead of just canceling it out entirely. And that's pretty powerful. Despite this being my first video, I know that a lot of you probably won't agree with the things that I've said, and will come up with like a number of reasons as to why maybe I should just stick to the rules in the book. After all, they're there for a reason, right? I agree with you to a degree. I think 5e is powerful not because it's the best set of rules or the easiest set of rules, but because they're the easiest set of rules to shift and change to fit your playstyle. And that's what this channel is ultimately going to be about. It's about making a game that fits your table. So if you like some of my rules, feel free to use them. If you don't like them, feel free to change them or just do whatever the hell you want to do. D&D is a game about having fun with your imagination, and I like to play with the rules in a way that I think will enhance the game. It doesn't necessarily mean it will enhance the game for your table. So if you do like what I'm doing, please like and subscribe. If you don't like what I'm doing, but you want to show support to a new content creator, also like and maybe subscribe and see if I'll do something that you like. But really, I want to thank you all for being patient with this new first video. As you can tell, this isn't a professional production. I had to learn like a number of programs just to get this running over the past couple of days because I was that excited about it. So I picked up Premiere Pro, After Effects, and Audition just so I could learn the basics enough to cut something together. So you notice that the cuts aren't great and the audio's awful. I guess the point is I want to thank you for being patient with me, and for those who subscribe and are the first few subscribers, it's really going to make my day. So thanks. Take care.